Hi, welcome to this knowledge clip on semi-structured in-depth interviews. My name is Derwin Lynch. Maybe you're new to doing interviews and you need some guidance on how to proceed. Or you might already be familiar with interviews, but you would simply like to refresh your memories on the essentials. Hopefully this video will prepare you better for the upcoming interviews you might have planned. Today, I will talk about a few aspects. First, I will touch upon the general aspects of interviews. So, why choose the interview? What is it? And I will also explain different types and structures of interviews. I will, however, focus a little bit more on semi-structured in-depth interviews. Then I will discuss the design of the interview, how to phrase your questions, choose your wordings, and the idea of probing. After that, I will focus on you, the interviewer, how to prepare yourself better for that role. You will notice that building rapport is an important element of the interview, and I will discuss some essential skills and considerations for you to feel more prepared. I will end with some sort of a general visualization. How does it all look like? So, an interview might seem like an everyday normal conversation where you pose questions and you get answers. And most of the theory related to it seems like common sense knowledge. However, doing the interview in practice can be a little bit challenging. So it's good to pay attention to a few of these characteristics of interviews. First of all, it's a controlled interaction with you as the researcher, the interviewer, as the main instrument of this data collection method. Second, you want to achieve something. Your interview always serves a specific purpose, which is directly related to your research objective and your research question. An interview has a direction and a shape because you, as the interviewer, are in charge and you want to know something, right? You want some information and you have a direction and a shape to achieve that. But an interview is also a dynamic relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee, which means that because of this social interaction, this dynamic, it's important to be empathic, but also analytical at the same time. That's how you get the most out of your interview. The interview is a co-production of knowledge of the researcher, choosing and framing questions, and the interviewer, answering those questions, but also the interviewer probing further and with the interviewee co-construct knowledge. So for what reasons might you use interviews? What purpose do they serve? First of all, interviews are very popular in qualitative research. It's one of the main data collection methods. They're very flexible, but also efficient. They are a very good way of relating the what, why, and the how. If you make your research proposal and you are addressing a particular problem, you select your participants. An interview guide and preparing for the interview will help you connect those theories, what you want to explore, with how you're going to explore that. Interviews are also a very powerful way of understanding others. So, in depth exploration, which is in the core of qualitative research, where you want to understand perspectives in order for you maybe to go further and transform aspects. So the interviews lead to rich data, and they are a very good way of exploring people's perceptions, views, attitudes, but also values, motivations, meanings, etc., etc. How people perceive and construct their reality. Many purposes. There are also different types of interviews. I will not explain them all, but just for you to have an idea, interviews can be done in a wide variety of forms. You can have the individual face-to-face interview, which is very common, but also a face-to-face group interview, an interview via email, or a self-administered questionnaire, but also a telephone interview. So these different forms also indicate that there are different types of interviews. And in this video lecture, I will distinguish three types: structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. And as discussed before, interviews serve many purposes. They can be used in marketing, to gather political opinions, understand therapeutic reasons, evaluations of certain things, but also, of course, produce data for academic analysis, qualitative research. So an interview can be a one-time brief exchange of 5 minutes over the telephone, for example, a workshop evaluation, or a multiple lengthy session string of interviews spanning over days if you're, for example, interviewing someone on their biography. So there are three structured types of interviews, which I introduced in this video. Um, One is very structured, more like a questionnaire with the questions already fixed. That's more when you want to test an hypothesis, so deductive research is there the core. That's on the one side. On the other side, you have inductive research. That's very unstructured, where you want to develop theory. So you're going to explore way more. That also takes way more time. In the middle, you have semi-structured interviews, and that's the focus of this particular video. We take elements from deductive, so already established theories, but also are very open to the understandings of the interviewees, and therefore also a little bit unstructured. We call it semi-structured. I don't want to go very in detail on these three different structures of interviews, but just to give you some tools on how to feel that you're in semi-structured interviews. I have this table now in front of you. Let's look at structured interviews first. As I mentioned before, those are to test an hypothesis. So you already have the questions in a pre-established order or category, and sometimes also the answers already standardized. In most cases, you want the questions to be asked in the same order, voice, and tone. On the other extreme, the unstructured, those are way more in depth. You want to explore a particular context. You're open to the stories of the participant. And rather than really having a question and answer format, it's more of an evolving conversation. In the middle, we have semi-structured interviews. Here the topics are fixed and question and answer method is the way forward. So the interviewer sets the frameworks and the themes, and within these themes, new questions might emerge due to probing. And the interviewer does not determine what is said, but what kind of things are said. Um, and semi-structured is way more dynamic and flexible to open to the experience. Some things about constructing questions in the interview. The first thing that I want to mention is, try to have your questions open-ended rather than closed. Open-ended questions allow for a broad range of answers. So think of questions that start maybe with what or why, how do you feel? Think about blah 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 blah. Um, you want to avoid closed questions. So questions where only a few answers are possible. Sometimes you can have a few closed questions in the beginning, but the idea of qualitative research is to go more in depth. So you want to have as much open-ended questions as possible. You do want to think carefully of the structure, the logical flow of your questions. Um, your questions cover a wide range of topics related to your theoretical background and your sub-questions. But you might want to think of questions that are aimed to set a comfortable atmosphere, so introductory questions, and then slowly going to your key questions and have room for probing. You can also make use of assisting tools such as vignettes or visualizations, a verbal diary, or the ranking method. Those are different tools that you can use during the interview to, yeah, as a tool to structure and to get more in depth on the topic. What you want to avoid is asking your main research question immediately. So make well difference between analytical and interview questions. You want to avoid also leading questions or questions that imply certain judgments. Wording matters. This is very important, of course. Once you have all your questions, do check how they were, yeah, how they are phrased. Check, for example, if you don't have biased or leading questions. These are questions that they're phrased in such a way that not all answers are equally acceptable. For example, as a board member of the tennis club, do you often visit the match? You also want to avoid multiple questions. So these are treating different topics at the same time. For example, how would you rate the health and well-being of your patients? You want to avoid ambiguous questions, questions that don't specify which part of the question needs to be addressed. For example, do you visit the physician regularly? Probing. Probing is a way to, these are follow-up questions that you don't necessarily have entirely prepared already in your interview guide, but you can probe to go more in depth. There are different types of probing, ways of probing. Sometimes you want to showcase an affirmative comment. For example, yes, I see. Or you might say, right. Sometimes you want to clarify something. So you might say, tell me more. Or could you explain blah, 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 blah. Or what do you mean with? Sometimes you want to seek the next step. For example, somebody said something and then you might ask, and then what happened? Or you might say, please go on. You might also want to seek further reasons and motivations. So why do you think that? Or is that what you just mentioned related to that what you said? In other case, you want to revise something. For example, you told me in the beginning about blah 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 blah, but in light of what you say now, could you explain blah blah blah? And sometimes a silence is also a way of probing. It's a non-verbal behavior, but it sometimes can show a certain empathy, a certain feeling, connection, or give the other person just space to talk further, to explain further. Also important to take note of certain cross-cultural aspects. For example, comparability of concepts. Not all concepts mean in the same context the same things. So sometimes you have to make explicit what you mean. For example, the word challenge might be considered in certain contexts as a barrier, but I once did a study on disability inclusion. And during the interview, I understood that the interviewee actually thought of the word challenge, related that with physically challenged, which is not immediately related to challenges. Language and translation. You always try to have the interview in the language of your interviewee. So that's, or the preferred language of the interviewee. This is not always possible. So you might need to think of translation and the cost related to translation, but also data that might be lost in translation. Take close attention to some cultural attitudes and beliefs. In certain contexts, gender, marital status, certain taboo topics, social economic status, religion, or just the act of posing questions, critics, and conflict might not be valued in the same way as they are in your context. You might need to think of how you will gain access to your particular group of people that you would like to interview. Certain areas might be very remote, or you might need an approval of a leader. Certain communities might be closed. Certain organizations, you might need the approval first of the management board, for example, or parents when you want to interview their children. So you need to think about gaining access. And not only the other has a culture, sometimes cultural differences are very close by. So pay attention to that as well. Sampling is an important thing to consider when you interview, your sampling strategy, when you will select your respondents. In qualitative research, random sampling is not so useful. Instead, you want to sample, you want your sampling to be defined by common characteristics. Um, a lot of times we use purposive sampling because you want to carefully select the information rich cases that will help you answer the main research question. You cannot interview 100 people, so you need to make choices. The aim in qualitative research is to explore in depth rather than to generalize. You want to have some sort of diversity ensured among your participants. Your participants represent, they're a sample of a particular population with those characteristics. So you might want to think of the diversity and see who is represented in your study. In some cases, you might want to have demographic representation or diversity among stakeholders, among all those that you interview, or representation of ideas, so cognitive diversity. That can be, for example, different people with different political or world views. So there are different selection methods. You can invite people by emailing them, but you can also use the snowball method. Once you interview one person, you ask whether that person has someone else to recommend for an interview. In most cases, you sample until you reach saturation. So no new information is being obtained by having more interviews. Building rapport is also a very important thing to take into consideration. Rapport, in this case, when we talk about rapport in interviews, it's about a comfortable, cooperative relationship between you and the interviewee. And you need to focus on this because in this state of rapport, feelings of satisfaction and empathy are maintained. It has both an emotional and a cognitive part. So you want the participants to feel well and accepted. You don't want to be aggressive from both sides. At the same time, you want to use the interview questions to analyze and evaluate certain content and certain experiences. So it's a balance between certain cognitive aspects and emotional well-being. You have to continuously make sure that the interviewer's conceptualizations meet the interviewee's conceptualization. So an emotional balance is here important. But how to develop this report? There are, I would say, roughly three different types of factors that can influence building or developing rapport. First, you have these cognitive factors. The first one being how to conceptualize the interview situation. You should think about what the interview is about. So, how you present the aim of the research, who is the interviewer, what is expected from the interviewer, what is going to be done with the information, the introduction of a voice recording. Those are cognitive factors that influence the development of report from the beginning. So, clear understanding of the roles will help clear understanding of the roles will help to create a good relationship through the course of the interview. It's also important that the interviewer has a clear idea of his own conceptualizations, his own position as a researcher. There are also social factors. You want to have a polite and a friendly social interaction. Most people want to be seen as likable and they want to be liked. So it's very important to have respect and politeness within your interview. Also be aware that first impressions are lasting in some cases. Think about how you use, what kind of language you use, how you appear, your clothing style. Will you, for example, dress very yeah, classic in a suit if you're going to interview farmers on a farm. And also think about the affective factors. These can be anxiety, for example, if the interviewer or the interviewee sees itself as a sort of help, as a source of help, or when the interviewee, the one is being interviewed, sees the interviewer as an intruder. That might also give anxiety. Think about that level, status differences. So these are certain things to take into consideration when thinking about how will I develop that rapport, that trustworthy relationship. Other aspects are maintaining eye contact. In many cultures, this means I'm interested, active listening. You do want to practice social distancing. It's inappropriate to touch. Maybe a handshake. Well, not in these times, but normally a handshake is considered, a respectful way of greeting. An active listening posture, so your body forward, your body towards the speaker. Sometimes you want to nod. You're not continuously looking at your watch. Those things are active listening. It's an active listening posture. But also think of other language styles. Will you joke, for example, a lot or not? Will you use informal language or jargon? Be aware of your tone of voice. All those things influence building rapport. Ultimately, you want to have that feeling of empathy. So you want to maintain that good relationship, regardless of how the interview might behave or what kind of things the interviewee says during the interview. So make sure that you as an interviewer keep your judgmental attitude separate from the relationship. And this requires building that empathy. It does require some complex conceptualizations of behavior and motives. Um, but having empathy and putting yourself in someone else's shoes helps to understand better that perspective. You want to have a balance between a very empathic, socially, not emotional, but very interested listener versus an analytical listener. So you need to balance analytical and empathical listening. Empathical listening is listening with a sincere intention to understand the person, engage in that way in the other's way of thinking. And analytical listening is when you also make connections already. And that happens automatically, that you make connections with your theories and your sub-questions, so that you can probe, for example, further. I would also recommend to pay attention to when and how you listen, summarize, and clarify. You want to listen carefully to what the participant has to say. It is important to just focus on what is said and postponing your own judgment and critique. You want to sometimes summarize what has been said and check whether you have got it right. You always let the decision of what a statement means and how it should be put down with a participant, of course. The purpose of summarizing is to check your interpretations of the story or to show that you take the participant seriously. And you can do that by repeating certain things that are said. And that can be on the level of the content or on the emotion. For example, I hear you're very enthusiastic about something. Or it can be just to check a relationship. For example, I get the idea that you're not totally at ease with what's happening after this interview. So sometimes you want to summarize verbal or nonverbal communication. You also want to clarify certain times questions to gain more in-depth understanding. So these are questions that, might be, for example, what do you mean or why do you think that? Think about when and how you listen, summarize, and clarify. You also want to balance that. So to almost finalize, how does the interview look like? Well, you start with the start of the interview, and developing rapport already starts with the first contact, the invitation letter or the phone call, the email, where you present the purpose of the research, and you confirm the appointment. That's already starting the interview. When you come to a place or where you meet up for the interview, the location, or maybe it's your office, always be on time. Do not rush to the interview. Check your clothing, have an open body language, and take control of the physical space. Then you will actually open the interview. You will introduce the procedures, the teams and the topics, the use of a voice recorder. So that's when you start to build that report in the setting. Maybe you also, maybe not, you explain the rights of the participant, so the informed consent or a reimbursement. Then you start to develop the interview, and the developing phase is the in-depth exploration. You keep on building rapport and you focus on, yeah, making sure that you understand what the participant is saying. You continue the interview until you have all your questions answered. Continuously keep nurturing that trustworthy environment. Then to end, you finish the interview, you still keep rapport. You don't just leave the participant up in the air. So you maybe come to a small conclusion of the interview, summarizing what has been said. Um, but you also check if there is a mutual satisfaction, right? You can ask for additions after your summary, or you can inform what is next, that you will send a member check, a thank you, a gift, or think about those things to close the interview. Few small things before I end on reliability and validity. So reliability has two elements: the inter-respondent consistency and the inter-interviewer consistency. Um, the inter-respondent consistency is to make sure that among your responders, your participants, there is some form of consistency. Consistency. You can improve on this by having an interview guide, a uniform interview guide. Of course, you have probing, but in general, you have a uniform interview guide to ensure consistency. And the more interviews you have, leading to data saturation, the more your inter-respondent consistency increases. The inter-interviewer consistency is when you're dealing with multiple interviewers, multiple researchers. Make sure to use recordings and to pilot the interview and to train all the interviewers on approaching the interviews in a similar way. Then you have aspects of validity: construct validity, content validity, and phase validity. Construct validity is, does the interview reflect the underlying constructs, the theories? Content validity, do the questions cover the subject range? And phase validity, sometimes you can already see if a certain question is valid or not by looking at the face of a respondent when posing that question. Trust is a very important thing. You need to, if you give your respondent sufficient trust to express themselves, of course, this also increases the validity. And you can also improve on the validity by triangulation. So using multiple data collection methods or using different data sources. This entire video is not about ethics, but it's also always very important to take ethical considerations into account. You don't want to harm, damage, or distress your participants or deceive them. You always have a written or a verbal informed consent. And you need to have a plan, a data management plan, so that you know and you can communicate how you deal with issues of confidentiality, anonymity. Sometimes doing qualitative, semi-structured, in-depth interview can be a very intense experience for the researcher, the interviewer. Be aware of this and discuss these ethical aspects within your research group. So to finalize, the take-home messages of this mini video are that the research interview is a more or less controlled interaction. You as the researcher, the interviewer, are the main data collection instrument. In a specific situation, it has a direction and a shape. You are in charge. It serves a particular purpose. You always collect data to answer your research question, and it's a very dynamic, reciprocal relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee. Doing the research interview is a skill, it's a craft. Practice makes perfect. It can be very challenging, but the more you practice, the better you become at it. It involves both empathic and analytical listening, and it needs proper preparation, the design, organization, and the entire management. With time, you will become a better interviewer. Thank you.